Hey everybody, welcome back to Chapter 7. Today we're going to be talking about interest groups in the United States government, what they are, how they work, and how they can affect U.S. government policy and U.S. federal policy. Now, really, when we talk about interest groups, there are two main ways that we need to talk about how people engage with a government system. And this is really based off of kind of two political theories in how people can influence the government system. Now, pluralist theory is based off the idea of pluralism, which is essentially this so-called marketplace of ideas, where you have all of these different ideas and they're out in the open and they compete with each other, and the best ideas are the ones that kind of rise to the top. Now, in the age of social media, we understand that we can kind of build ourselves silos and echo chambers where the ideas aren't necessarily going out to everybody. Those ideas might be kind of incubated in a favorable audience, and then when those kind of spill out into the collective public, they can have really particular and sometimes potentially dangerous consequences. And so pluralism theory is essentially this right for all groups to be heard. So the idea is that that competition will breed moderation in terms of how ideas and interests are carried out. On the other side of that, you have the elite theory. And the elite theory is basically where a ruling class composed of wealthy, educated individuals wield most of the power in government and also within top universities, corporations, military, and media outlets. So, elite theory is kind of that opposite of pluralism. It's the idea where the people that have influence in a government system are the ones who are able to influence that system in one way or another. Maybe they are prominent individuals, maybe they have positions of power and authority, and the people that are in those positions, in many cases, have either wealth or education that sets them apart from kind of the broad scale US public. Now, in the actual operation of the United States political system, both of these are kind of true simultaneously, in which we, as we've talked about before, you have prominent families that have been mainstays in U.S. politics for decades, and so you have this system in place where there is a bit of elite theory in practice in how government is affected. In the same way, pluralism is really developed as a way to explain kind of how interest groups operate. And interest groups are basically just organizations that seek to achieve goals by influencing government decision making. So, interest groups are groups in which individuals come together and then make their voice heard on a particular issue area. Interest groups also help individuals build social capital. Basically, have these person-to-person connections of individuals of a like mind, and kind of build their own connections, build their own esteem, and have that influence on government. Now, interest groups can take a lot of forms, and they have a lot of functions. The first of which could be to educate the population. So you take an interest group like Mothers Against Drunk Driving. This interest group is primarily focused on educating the public about the dangers of drunk driving. It's also focused on influencing policy that either increases punishment for drunk driving or increases focus on police forces operating checkpoints and things like that. So trying to ensure that individuals who are over the legal limit aren't out on the road. A second function of interest group could be to provide opportunities for activism. And these often come in a good example of this are things like civil rights groups. An individual who might have a particular viewpoint about a civil rights issue, an ethnic issue, a race issue, a gender equality issue, they will often be able to seek out specific interest groups that kind of channel that voice that many people across the nation might have, but kind of direct that into singular action. And in many ways, that can also be illustrated in the mobilization of citizens. So basically, interest groups kind of take that general underlying opinion within society, and then they take that and kind of focus that, direct that, and translate that into action. And then, in many ways, the interest groups also perform electoral functions. So, for example, in many instances, you have interest groups that will grade or rate specific candidates. In particular, the NRA is very prominent in its grade cards. So it releases a grade card and has two candidates running for office, and it says this candidate receives a C plus and this candidate receives an A, and they certify one of those candidates to basically say these are the actions they have taken on policies that we focus on, and this is how we think you should vote. So it kind of gives the electorate a little bit of a piece of research, a piece of information that they can take into the voting booth with them. You also have the provision of information to policymakers. So one of the things that interest groups often do, but that isn't often explained or discussed very much, is that interest groups can provide a major source of information for policymakers. So if you have a group that is dedicated to livestock and another group that is dedicated to manufacturing, and those two groups are able to educate policymakers on the types of necessities, requirements for a massive expansion plan of a manufacturing facility near a livestock area or near a range or pasture or something. And so they might have two different viewpoints on that, and they have that information and that research, and they can provide that to the lawmakers. Even if they're sometimes competing on some of these issues, they're focusing on their specific issue area and providing that information to the lawmaker. You also have this happen in think tanks, where you have an interest group that is focused on maybe First Amendment policy or maybe Second Amendment policy. And what they do is they get together, they write papers, they do research, and then they provide that information to the public and to lawmakers in order to try to help influence their decision or action on specific pieces of legislation. Many groups are organized to protect the common good. For example, the Coalition for Clean Water is an interest group that was focused primarily on, in recent years, focused primarily on cleaning up the inadequate and frankly awful water conditions in Flint, Michigan, in the water delivery systems. And so you have these interest groups in place that are not necessarily focused on economic policy or something like that, but they're focused on the common good, providing for the common good. And then they're part of the checks and balances system. You can't exactly see it here on the bottom because it kind of spilled over, but interest groups can provide advocacy for Congress or the bureaucracy, I mean. We'll talk about the bureaucracy a little bit later, but interest groups are often working closely with bureaucrats on the ground. And so interest groups can see what issues are occurring on the ground with the bureaucracy, and they can take that to legislators and kind of advocate on behalf of the bureaucrats. They also can try to work with these legislators in order to implement policies that would then be favorable back to bureaucrats. So it's this back and forth system where the interest groups are able to inform and educate that system. Now, in the case of interest groups, and we'll talk about this in our next lecture as well, but many interest groups form political action committees. And political action committees are private groups that are kind of pieces of an interest group that are able to raise money directly for a campaign. Interest groups can fund campaigns individually up to $5,000. But you also have the creation of super PACs, which are super political action committees, which are private groups that can raise unlimited funds, but they can't coordinate with the parties or the candidates themselves. And what you'll see with many super PACs is they'll raise a lot of money, and then they will mirror the messaging that is coming out from a campaign but in mirroring that messaging, they're not necessarily coordinating legally. It's important that to note that with the increase in political action committees and super PACs, you've seen an increase in spending in U.S. elections. In 2016, $1.3 billion in independent expenditures were made, with $594 million of that coming from super PACs. And then during the 2018 midterm, you had $815 million on 2,224 super PACs, so about $350,000 each on those 2,000 super PACs. And it might surprise you that the groups that spend the most are one, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is an umbrella organization. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But the U.S. Chamber of Commerce spent $103 million in campaign efforts. The National Association of Realtors spent $65 million, and various medical organizations kind of combined spent $87 million. So the interesting thing there is that the people that are exerting the most political influence or the most political cost with these systems aren't necessarily the ones that you would expect. But the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is basically, like I said, an umbrella organization representing all of kind of the small businesses in the United States, small to medium-sized businesses in the United States. The National Association of Realtors, specifically following the housing crisis in 2009 during the Great Recession. You had all of this focus on policy for realtors and real estate agents. And then medical organizations are always going to be up there in terms of how they're donating and spending money. Now, interest groups aren't PACs themselves, aren't political action committees themselves, but many of them have and operate PACs. And they generally focus on policy. Now, this is something that we're going to talk about in the next in the Chapter 8 lecture, when we're talking about political parties and how parties operate. Interest groups focus on the specific policy issues. They're focused on the NRA is focused on firearm policy, and that's pretty much it. They're not going to be focusing on animal welfare laws. They're not going to be focusing on medical laws. They're not going to be focusing on manufacturing requirements or anything like that. So they're a singularly focused entity that is focused on an issue. Parties, on the other hand, are going to be focused on personnel. So, and then parties are very broad in nature. So when I talk about interest groups kind of influencing the system and serving as subject matter experts, you have these individuals and interest groups that are focused on their primary issue area, and they try to do what they can to ensure that the lawmakers and laws come in their favor. Now, interest groups require people, obviously. You can't have an interest group if you don't have people within that interest group. And there are a couple of different ways that interest groups can form. Generally, what you're going to see are membership associations. So membership associations are interest groups in which the members play a large role. Maybe they'll pay dues. And in many cases, they'll be volunteer. So you'll have a membership association like a historical society. You pay dues into that historical society. There's a volunteer board of directors, and they'll operate specific interests within maybe a community. So for a local historical society, they might be engaging in activities that are educating the population on the historical past. Now, a larger group would often be represented by a staff organization. A staff organization is where you have a professional staff that's conducting most of the activities, but interest group support might come from individuals through small donations or fundraising drives or things like that. You don't necessarily have to pay into membership, but they can donate to that cause and then help that organization carry out that system. Now, when it comes to the reasons that people, and forgive the incorrect heading here, when it comes to the reasons that people will join a interest group, there are a lot of different reasons. First of all, I mean, there are always going to be people who join for swag. They'll go to a table, sign their name, and get a free T-shirt. But generally, there are a couple of main areas that the three main areas that you will see have interest groups develop around. The first are solidarity incentives. These are things like the Sierra Club or the National Rifle Association. These are groups in which solidarity is really the group is based around companionship or the satisfaction of socializing with others around a certain cause. So the National Rifle Association is membership generally around the community of gun owners, the resources for gun owners, and the advocacy for gun owners. In the same way, the Sierra Club is rallied around a desire to protect the environment or implement policy that will protect the environment. You also have purpose incentives, which are based on ideology. So in here you have things like the National Right to Life, which is an ideological standpoint, oftentimes informed by a religious motivation, or groups like PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. These are ideologically based organizations, and through that, through purpose incentives, they feel like their activity is able to have an impact on the policy system itself. And then you have economic incentives, and these are fairly common. These are groups in which you get some benefit if you are a member. And so, for example, the National Association of Police Organizations, people will be members of that because that group might advocate for policies that provide body armor to police officers or equipment to police officers, or create grants to make that available. And the same thing with the AARP. Members might get specific group benefits or group rates on hotels and travel and things like that, or policies like Social Security, that they have a lobbying arm there that prevents or does its best to ensure that Social Security remains stable in that way. Now, many people will organize in an interest group, and they'll organize in several different ways. So you have economic interest groups. These are kind of like before groups that are going to organize around an economic purpose. You might have corporations or business interests, something like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, or an umbrella organization like AFL-CIO, which basically takes together a lot of these different organizations, different unions, and kind of organizes them together. You might have groups around agriculture and trade, so something like the American Farm Bureau Federation or the American Medical Association. These organizations are kind of joined together and focused on a specific area of an economic area of interest. And you might also have foreign policy interest groups. So you have these groups are focused on building partnerships or maintaining international relationships. So for something like the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, these are focused on these foreign policy systems ensuring stability in a global community. And you have public and ideological interest groups. So these are focused on perceived collective goods. These are goods that everybody's going to use. But that sometimes comes with the free rider problem. I got my images switched here. If you've seen Community, Jeff, basically the main character in the center here, forms a study group in order to kind of glean just get the answers to the Spanish test. Eventually that has a character arc and that sort of thing. But essentially he's a free rider in that first system where he's just kind of benefiting off of the work of other people. And when it comes to these public and ideological interest groups, that will happen a lot of the time, where you have these collective goods where there's always an issue of are the people who are going to benefit always going to be the people who did the work, or are they going to be sometimes the people who didn't necessarily do all the work? And then you have consumer interest groups where they're focused on consumer protection. So they might be like the Better Business Bureau, where they are looking at different businesses and ensuring that businesses are operating in a safe and secure and standardized way, and ensuring that people aren't taking advantage of other individuals. You might have environmental interests that are focused on the protection of the environment and wildlife. These organizations are generally going to basically focus on these public goods, collective goods, and ensuring that the policies and actions that take place are take into consideration wildlife and environment. We talked a little bit earlier about constitutional protection of the environment or specifically with waterways, and how there has been a push in recent years toward applying those constitutional protections toward waterways, specifically when activity on a waterway in one state can affect another state, or damming up water in one community can flood another. And so there's been more of a discussion on that. And then you have groups that focus on religious activism. So you might have political activism through religious values. Sometimes that might be ideological, based on promoting a specific religion. But in many cases, you have interfaith communities which gather together basically of a variety of faiths and promote morality and ethics, moral ethics, and generally increasing faith and increasing tolerance of the religious community overall. And so you'll have that in many instances. Now, in order for an interest group to be effective, they have to ensure that their policies go into place. And there's a lot of different ways they can do that. They can do that through general activism, but one of the most common tools that they will use is lobbying. And lobbying is a process by which an interest will seek to influence policy through direct pressure on government officials. They will have individuals or a team of individuals directly connecting with the people who are making the laws in order to ensure that their favored laws go into effect. And there are a couple of different ways that lobbying can happen. First, the most common at the federal level is to lobby Congress. And that's purely because there are a lot of Congress people. Yes, it is preferable to lobby the party leaders, but even lobbying any member of Congress is going to, in many cases, be kind of a ticket to at least some sort of end. If you can't lobby Congress, it is always preferable to lobby the president. Lobbying the president is incredibly effective, but it can be extremely difficult. The president is a single individual and often has a very limited amount of time. And so if you're able to lobby directly with the president, not only, even if the president doesn't necessarily publicize that specific issue, the fact that you have met with the president is enough to sometimes start a discussion in Congress, and then you can go back. If you've been heard by a president, then you can go back to Congress and kind of expand on those issues. Now, if you can't lobby Congress, you can't lobby the president, you could always try to lobby executive branch officials. That might be the vice president, that might be cabinet members, that might be secretaries or undersecretaries. And this has the benefit of there's more of them available, and if you can influence one, then you have the opportunity then to carry that on up to the president. So if you get the ear of the person who has the ear of the president, that can be incredibly beneficial in terms of a lobbying strategy. And the way that interest groups set up and organize and operate, they often form what's called the Iron Triangle. Now, the Iron Triangle is between the interest groups, Congress, and the executive. But then the executive, it's calling it the bureaucracy here, because the bureaucracy is a part of the executive that's carrying out those individual day-to-day tasks. So first of all, Congress funds the bureaucracy and provides political support for that bureaucracy. But like I mentioned before, interest groups can benefit from special favors and low regulation from the bureaucracy itself. And they can all these interest groups can then provide electoral support to Congress to get the bureaucracy in place that they want. And the same way it goes the other way, where Congress can pass friendly legislation in favor of interest groups. Interest groups can lobby on behalf of the bureaucracy, and then the bureaucracy can execute the policy in an effective and efficient way that can make it easier for Congress to kind of carry out its political goals. And then finally, when we talk about interest groups, one of the main interest group strategies you'll oftentimes see is an issue network, in which public officials, elected leaders, activists, and interest groups will come together for a common purpose. So what you'll often see is something like the healthcare issue network, where the Food and Drug Administration, the Office of the President, the Congress, private groups like Pfizer and Cigna, but then interest groups like the American Medical Association will basically all come together. So you have business interests, you have specific interest groups, you have groups supporting, in this case, doctors or pharmacists, and then you have government branches like the FDA, the Office of the President, and Congress kind of all coming together and making these decisions and informing the healthcare policy. If you have a seat at the table, then you can have your voice heard. If you don't have a seat at the table, then you don't have your voice heard. And many citizens generally will dislike interest group systems because in the larger interest groups, people will think of it as kind of pay for play or dark money systems where maybe an interest group lobbies a congressperson for a while, and then once they retire from Congress, they get a nice cushy speaking job on behalf of that interest group or a lobbying job on behalf of that interest group. And that has kind of soured people to interest groups. But in one way, interest groups can really offer the broad public the opportunity to engage in the political process, specifically when it comes to grassroots organizing and actually going forward and being part of that group, because interest groups can have a tremendous impact in local policy. So as we go forward, make sure you're continuing to read on those chapters. This was kind of a brief overview of a chapter. It goes way more in depth in the actual text, but I wanted to introduce you to that subject. But in the meantime, continue reading, continue working, and I'll see you guys in the next lecture. Bye.